He didn't know. The woman in the wheelchair was his boss. Not until the day she slid a letter across the table. His hands trembled as his eyes fell on the words. It was his own termination signed by her. Her name was Sarah Donovan. By the age of 46, she had built an empire from nothing, a billion-dollar company known for its innovation, its culture, its heart. She was the kind of leader who remembered birthdays, who stopped in the hallway to ask about your family, who would sit beside an intern at lunch just to hear their ideas. People called her the CEO with a conscience. But in the months after the accident, her world shifted. One rainy evening, a driver ran a red light. The impact was violent, the damage lasting. And so, for the first time in her life, Sarah moved through the world in a wheelchair. She thought the hardest challenge ahead would be her own recovery. She was wrong. It started with a single envelope left on her desk. No name, no return address, just one line scrawled across the top. You should see what's happening at your flagship branch. Inside was a collection of messages, some typed, some handwritten, from employees she'd never met. Their words told the same story. Managers turning a blind eye to harassment. Customers treated differently because of how they looked or moved. A workplace where cruelty was disguised as company standards. Sarah read every letter twice. Then she sat in silence, staring at the window. This was her company, her name on the building. And yet, this was happening under her watch. The more she thought about it, the clearer the answer became. If she walked in as the CEO, she'd see staged smiles and polite lies. But if she walked in as someone else, she might finally see the truth. 2 weeks later, she had a new ID badge, a new name, a role at the very bottom, administrative support. No fanfare, no introductions. No one knew who she really was. As she rolled through the glass doors that morning, she believed she was ready for anything. But Sarah Donovan was about to learn that the company she thought she knew was about to show her a side she could never have imagined. The branch was busy that morning, the kind of steady hum that made everything feel normal on the surface. Phones ringing, printers clicking, the low murmur of customers discussing orders. That's when she saw him. Mark Reynolds, branch manager. On paper, he was the company's golden boy. Polished, well-spoken, always first to shake hands when a senior executive visited. He knew how to charm the people who signed his paycheck. But charm has a way of slipping when it's not needed. Sarah first noticed it when an elderly man, leaning heavily on a cane, approached the counter with a question about a delayed order. His voice was gentle, almost apologetic. Mark listened for less than 10 seconds before cutting him off mid-sentence, his tone sharp, impatient. And when the man had walked away, still without an answer, Mark turned to a nearby staff member and let out a laugh that had no warmth in it. Some people just shouldn't bother coming in, he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. Sarah kept her eyes down, pretending to focus on the papers in her lap. Minutes later, another scene unfolded. A young employee, clearly nervous, approached Mark about a scheduling conflict. Her voice wavered as she explained that her sister had been taken to the hospital and she needed to leave early. Mark didn't ask a single question. He simply leaned back in his chair and told her, "If you can't handle the job, maybe you shouldn't be here at all." The girl's face tightened. She nodded quickly, whispered an apology, and walked away, shoulders hunched. Sarah felt something inside her shift. This wasn't just poor leadership. This was cruelty in plain sight. She said nothing. She simply took a quiet breath and made a decision she didn't plan on sharing with anyone. This man was not going to keep that seat for long. The morning rush had settled into a rhythm. Customers came and went, the faint hiss of the coffee machine from the break area mixing with the tap of keyboards. Sarah sat at her small desk near the front corner, reviewing a stack of invoices that had been dropped off without a word. They were thick, far more than one person should carry at once, and the papers kept sliding sideways. She repositioned them on her lap and began to wheel herself toward the records room. The chair's front wheels caught the edge of the carpet, jolting the stack in her hands. Several employees saw her struggling. She noticed their eyes flick toward her and then away again. One returned to their phone, another to their monitor. No one moved. Halfway down the hall, The weight shifted again, and the top folders began to tip. Sarah tightened her grip, adjusting her speed, but it was no use. The papers slipped, scattering across the floor in a quiet ripple. Before she could bend forward, a voice broke through the room. "Hang on, I've got it." It was Mia, a cashier barely in her 20s, with an easy, natural kindness in her tone. She crouched beside Sarah, carefully gathering the papers and lining them up in neat stacks. She didn't make a joke about it. She didn't sigh or act like it was a burden. She simply said, "It happens to all of us." Sarah thanked her softly, taking the stack back with a nod. But as Mia returned to her station, another voice cut through, louder this time. Mark. He was leaning against the counter, speaking to two supervisors as though they were old friends. His tone carried enough for the nearby team to hear. "You see what I mean?" he said casually. "Dead weight. Slowing everyone down. This place runs smoother without situations like that." Laughter followed, quick, sharp, and uncomfortable. Sarah didn't look up. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She simply adjusted the papers again, her hand steady but her chest tight. In that moment, the building felt bigger than it had minutes ago. The hum of conversation seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a cold quiet in her mind. Humiliation has a way of echoing, not just in the ears but deep in the heart. And sitting there, she felt the familiar, isolating weight of being unseen and unwanted. But Mark had made one mistake. One thing he could never have guessed. What Mark didn't know was that Sarah's every move was being recorded. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself crossing paths with Mia more often. Mia had that rare quality, the kind of presence that made even the longest days feel lighter. She treated every customer as though they were the only one in the store. She knew the regulars by name, remembered their preferences, even noticed when someone seemed out of sorts. During lunch breaks, Sarah learned bits and pieces of her life. Mia was the oldest of three, working 2 jobs to help her mother keep their home. She'd been with the company for 2 years and had never been late, not once. Yet her schedule was constantly shifted, sometimes with barely a day's notice. One afternoon, Mia hesitated before speaking. "Mark doesn't like it when people stand up to him," she said quietly. Sarah asked her what she meant. Mia explained that schedules weren't just schedules here. They were weapons. If Mark decided you'd stepped out of line, suddenly you'd be working every late shift or back-to-back weekends. If he liked you, you'd get the prime hours, the easier days. No one could officially prove it, but everyone knew it was deliberate. Sarah listened without interrupting. She knew exactly what Mia was describing. She'd seen managers like that in other companies. Ones who understood that control didn't always require yelling. Sometimes it just meant quietly taking away a person's stability. 2 days later, Sarah spotted her chance to help. A couple walked into the branch looking for a high-value purchase, the kind that could single-handedly push a month's sales target over the line. They wandered near Mia's register, scanning the shelves. Sarah noticed Mia was already helping another customer. Without drawing attention, Sarah approached the couple. She asked questions, listened carefully, and guided them toward the exact product they needed. When Mia became free, Sarah handed them over seamlessly, introducing her as the best person to finalize everything. The sale went through. It was big, the kind of sale that earned not just commission, but recognition. Mia's eyes lit up when she realized what Sarah had done. She mouthed thank you across the floor. Sarah just gave a small nod and went back to her desk. But the moment didn't last. Later that afternoon, Sarah overheard Mark in the break room, chatting with another supervisor. His voice was casual, confident. "That couple earlier? Yeah, I closed that one myself. Just good timing, I guess." He said it like it was nothing, like it was just another day of him saving the branch. Sarah didn't speak up. Not yet. She simply filed the moment away, another piece in the puzzle, another line in the story she was quietly collecting. And though Mia smiled as she passed her later, Sarah could see it in her eyes, the quiet frustration of watching someone else claim your work. This was the game Mark played, and Sarah was just getting started. By the end of the week, the entire branch was called into the main floor for a company-wide meeting. Rows of folding chairs filled the space, the hum of quiet chatter fading as Mark stepped to the front. He held a clipboard under one arm, his voice loud enough to fill the room without a microphone. "All right, everyone," he began, flashing that polished, performative confidence he saved for large groups. "Today we're talking about efficiency, about moving faster, thinking ahead." He scanned the crowd, pausing for effect. Then his eyes landed on Sarah. And he said, his tone shifting ever so slightly, sometimes about what happens when we don't. A few heads turned in her direction. He strolled over to a counter set up as a demonstration area, arranging a small stack of forms and a handheld scanner. "Let's say," he continued, "you've got a customer waiting, a deadline approaching, and the work needs to move quickly." His words stretched, his pacing intentional. But instead it drags, and drags, and drags. A ripple of soft laughter broke from one corner of the room. Mark let it sit there, feeding off it. It's like pushing a cart with one wheel missing. More laughter now. Sarah sat still, her hands resting lightly on the wheels of her chair. The silence inside her was louder than the noise around her. Mark gave a mock sigh and shook his head. And when that happens, the whole team suffers. The meeting moved on, but the message had been delivered. Everyone heard it. Everyone understood who it was aimed at. For Sarah, it wasn't the insult that stayed with her. It was the way the room had allowed it to happen. The way people looked down at their hands instead of speaking up. She'd been in leadership long enough to know that silence in moments like these was a form of permission. Mark thought he was in control. He thought this was his stage. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly guess, was that the woman he was mocking was the one who held the future of his paycheck in her hands. In the days after that meeting, Sarah moved with even greater care. She understood that anger, no matter how justified, was a dangerous thing when acted on too soon. So she waited, and while she waited, she watched. Her small desk near the front had one advantage. She could see and hear almost everything. A customer struggling to read a form because of failing eyesight, and Mark sighing impatiently, cutting them off mid-question. A staff member with a hearing aid asking for instructions to be repeated, and Mark waving them away with a dismissive gesture. Each incident was tucked neatly into her memory, recorded in a way only she knew. A folded slip of paper here, a quiet voice memo into her phone when no one was around. Dates, times, details, each one precise. But it wasn't just what she saw from her desk. Sarah began arriving 15 minutes earlier than her shift started, just as the janitorial staff were finishing their rounds. Most people passed them without more than a nod, but Sarah stopped to speak. She asked their names. She learned that Maria had 2 grandsons who played soccer on the weekends, and that Henry was saving for his daughter's college tuition. They weren't used to being listened to. And it didn't take long before they started telling her what they'd seen after hours, the arguments between Mark and his supervisors, the way he spoke when no customers were in sight. One evening, as Sarah was preparing to leave, Henry approached her in the hallway. His voice was low, almost cautious. "I think you should see this," he said, pulling a worn manila folder from his cleaning cart. She opened it just enough to glimpse a set of old HR documents, complaints, reports, memos that never seemed to have gone anywhere. On the top sheet, a name was circled in heavy black ink. It wasn't Mark's name, but it was someone closely tied to him, someone who could, in the right circumstances, bring his entire career down in one move. Sarah closed the folder slowly, nodding in thanks. She didn't ask how Henry had found it. Some truths arrive exactly when you're ready for them. And in that moment, Sarah knew the storm she'd been quietly building was nearly ready to break. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day where the hours blur together until one moment freezes them in place. A man walked in, his steps uneven but determined. His hair was cut short, his jacket worn at the elbows, the metals on the lapel catching the light. Sarah noticed the cane first, then the way his left hand trembled slightly as he pulled a folder from under his arm. He reached the counter and explained, in a steady voice, that he was a veteran. His shipment had been delayed, and the contents were urgently needed for a medical appointment the next day. The paperwork he handed over was in perfect order. Mark took one glance and shook his head. "You're missing the updated clearance form," he said flatly. The veteran frowned. "This is the form your office gave me." Mark slid it back across the counter. "Then they gave you the wrong one." Sarah watched the exchange, her chest tightening. The man's request was simple. The solution was even simpler. A quick call to the processing desk, a single signature, and the shipment could leave that afternoon. But Mark didn't pick up the phone. He didn't even look at the file again. He stood there, arms folded, as though this were a test. He had no intention of letting the man pass. The veteran's voice grew quieter. "Sir, I have a medical fitting tomorrow morning. Without this package, I'll have to wait another month." Mark shrugged. "Then you'll have to wait another month." There was no empathy, no attempt to help, just a cold, deliberate barrier. The veteran gathered his papers slowly, as though each movement weighed more than it should. He turned and walked toward the door, his cane tapping against the tile in uneven rhythm. Sarah's hands gripped the wheels of her chair. She felt the heat rise in her face, not from embarrassment this time, but from something deeper, something sharper. Because what Mark didn't see, what he had no idea about, was the small black lens positioned in the corner above the counter. A camera no one paid attention to anymore. A camera that had just recorded every second of the exchange. Sarah didn't need more evidence after that. She already had enough to move forward. But in that moment, something inside her shifted from patience to certainty. This was the line, and Mark Reynolds had just crossed it. The inspection began on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Mark didn't appear worried. In fact, he seemed almost entertained. The inspectors had arrived without warning, but he'd convinced himself they were here for a different department. As he led them through the aisles, he tossed casual remarks over his shoulder. "We're in a tight ship here. You won't find much out of order." The first inspector, a woman in a navy suit, carried a clipboard and asked polite, predictable questions. Mark answered them smoothly, his voice dipped in confidence. But the second inspector barely spoke. He stayed to the side, hands clasped loosely in front of him, eyes moving from one detail to the next. Mark hardly noticed him. To Mark, he was just another pair of shoes on the floor, an observer, nothing more. Sarah, from her desk, saw what Mark didn't. That second inspector was Daniel Hayes, her chief operating officer, a man who had worked beside her for 15 years. He wasn't here to watch the process. He was here to watch Mark. As the tour moved forward, questions shifted. The polite inquiries about staffing and inventory began to sharpen, subtle but unmistakable. "Can you explain this discrepancy in scheduling records? Why were these customer complaints closed without follow-up?" Mark's confidence flickered. He gave longer pauses before answering, his charm starting to thin. By the time they returned to the meeting room, a quiet storm had formed on the table. Neatly stacked were printed emails. Mark's own words, dismissive and cutting, forwarded by staff who had been on the receiving end. Beside them, still photographs pulled from security footage, moments of refusal, moments of mockery. And then a flash drive. Daniel slid it across the table toward the lead inspector. On it, the hidden camera footage of Mark turning away the disabled veteran, his words and tone as clear as if he were standing in the room. Mark glanced at the drive, then back at the inspectors, his jaw tight. He still didn't know who had put this all together. He still didn't know that the quiet woman at the desk outside was the one holding every thread. He thought this was just an inspection, but the truth was far sharper. This wasn't a review of the branch. This was the beginning of his reckoning. The boardroom was silent, except for the low hum of the air conditioner. Mark sat at the far end of the long table, arms resting on the polished surface, eyes flicking between the inspectors. The door opened, and in rolled Sarah Donovan. Not in the plain shirt and modest slacks she'd worn for weeks, but in a tailored charcoal suit, sharp lines, perfect cut, makeup flawless, hair neatly pulled back. Every inch, the leader she truly was. The shift in the room was immediate. Chairs shifted, breathing changed. Someone whispered her name under their breath. Mark's face went still. His lips parted, as though he meant to speak, but no sound came. Sarah moved to the head of the table, folded her hands. Her voice calm, controlled. "Good morning. My name is Sarah Donovan. I am a chief executive officer of this company." She let the words hang there. long enough for them to sink in. Then she began. One by one, the evidence hit the table. Printed emails, his words unfiltered, dripping with contempt for staff and customers alike. Photographs from security footage, moments they'd all witnessed but never thought would matter. Testimonies from employees who had stayed silent. Until now. And then the video. The disabled veteran, standing at the counter. Voice steady. Request simple. And Mark, refusing him without even touching the phone. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound, the faint click of the video ending. Sarah's eyes locked on Mark. Her tone didn't rise. Didn't need to. This is my company, she said. And what I have seen here is not who we are. Every example matched the scenes we had already lived with her. Every cruelty, now irrefutable fact on the table. Mark's hands pressed flat against the surface, knuckles pale. The easy arrogance he wore like armor, gone. Sarah leaned forward, just enough for her words to cut through the silence. This ends today. The silence hung heavy. Mark shifted in his seat, forcing a small laugh, the kind people use when they're trying to make a bad moment disappear. This is clearly a misunderstanding, he began, his voice scraping for calm. Those emails, they're out of context. In that video, you can't hear the whole conversation. Sarah didn't blink. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single envelope. She slid it across the table. The sound of paper against wood was the only noise in the room. Mark looked down. The color drained from his face. His hand hovered above the envelope for a moment before pulling it open. His eyes scanned the page. Termination. Effective immediately. The pen was already waiting beside it. His hand shook as he picked it up. The signature he scrawled looked nothing like the confident one he used to sign memos. Sarah waited until the pen touched the table again. Then she gave a small nod to the two security officers standing near the door. They stepped forward. Mark rose slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. No one in the room spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the steady rhythm of his shoes against the carpet as they led him out. Through the glass wall of the boardroom, staff watched. Some with shock, some with relief. Sarah remained at the head of the table, her posture unshaken, her gaze steady. The meeting wasn't over, but Mark Reynolds' career was. When the door closed behind Mark, the room exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Sarah let the silence sit, not as a threat now, but as a space for the weight of what had happened to settle. Then she spoke. This branch, she began, will not be remembered for the actions of one man. It will be remembered for what we choose to do next. She turned toward Mia, who was sitting 3 seats from the end, eyes wide, clearly not expecting to be addressed. Mia, Sarah said, her voice steady but warm, you've shown me what true customer care looks like. You've helped people without expecting anything in return. You've treated every person with dignity, no matter who they were. Mia shook her head slightly, as if to say she hadn't done anything special. Sarah continued, that's the standard this company should be built on. And that's why, effective immediately, I'm promoting you to assistant manager. There was a ripple in the room, not surprise at her choice, but approval. Mia's eyes filled with tears. She managed a quiet thank you, her voice catching just enough to reveal how much it meant. Sarah wasn't finished. From this day forward, she said, addressing the room again, we will be implementing stronger anti-discrimination training across all branches. And every employee will have direct access to a whistleblower channel that bypasses local management entirely. No one should fear speaking up. Heads nodded. Some people straightened in their chairs. The tone of the room was changing. After the meeting, as the others filed out, Sarah rolled toward the back corner where Henry, the janitor, was quietly wiping down a counter. He looked up, surprised. She stopped beside him and spoke just loud enough for him to hear. Henry, thank you for trusting me, for giving me that file. His eyes widened for a moment, then he gave a small, knowing nod. No cameras caught the moment. No applause followed. But Sarah knew this was where real change began. Not in headlines, not in speeches, but in the quiet acknowledgement of the people who had always been doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. The boardroom looked different now. The same long table, the same glass walls, the same morning light streaming in. but the weight in the air was gone. Sarah sat at the head, leaning slightly forward as a small group of her staff laughed at a shared story. Papers rustled, chairs shifted, the hum of easy conversation replacing the tension that once lived here. The same space where cruelty had been exposed was now filled with something else entirely. She glanced around the room, taking in each face, not as titles or positions, but as people. People who had shown courage. People who had been overlooked. People who deserved to be seen. In that quiet moment, she understood that her mission had changed. She had come here to test her staff, but she was leaving reminded that leadership isn't about power, it's about people. The meeting wound down, voices fading into the natural rhythm of a workday. Sarah turned toward the wide glass doors at the end of the hall. She rolled forward, the soft sound of the chair's wheels blending with the light chatter behind her. And as the doors opened, sunlight poured across the floor, warm, clear, and bright, lighting her path as she moved into whatever came next. Fade to black.